with CITROENS what seems like most of my life. I think around 41 years right now, or maybe even a little bit more than that. My business is selling CITROEN parts, and I've been either working on or selling parts for CITROENS for probably way too long. Anyhow, we're going to talk today a little bit about the history of the traction Avant, the fact that it's 80 years ago that it was introduced. It's actually a little bit more than 80 years ago. First of all, I'd like to recognize a couple people that, first of all, I'd like to recognize Camille Herb and the ladies, Rose and some of the other ladies who helped with the registration tent today and got you guys your car windshield plaque so we can have a voting for the People's Choice and all that. I'm not sure where Camille got to. I think she ran off. But now there she is, but I'd like to give a hand for all their help. Without them and a lot of the other people that helped do the volunteer things, I couldn't begin to pull this off. The other thing I want to make sure that I recognize is that Carlisle Events does several different awards programs and judging programs. I have to tell you, my traction has been at every Carlisle import show since its inception, and I can't tell you for sure, but I know it's been 27 years. It might actually be 28. The first 2 years that car actually was in the judging for the Best of Show. They used to do class judging on Saturday and a Best of Show on Sunday. That car came in second 2 times, and both years to the same guy with an Austin Healy beat me. But so CITROEN's got a little bit of a history of winning here. I can tell you Dale Martin was chosen as a Carlisle Elite recipient on Friday. That program is actually for cars that are on this show field on Friday. Early afternoon, the management and employees of Carlisle Events, who happen to know a little bit about cars because they have like a dozen shows here a year, they go around and they pick their 10 favorite cars that they feel should be chosen as a Carlisle Elite. A couple other CITROENs and derivatives have won in the past, but Dale Martin's car was chosen on Friday. So tomorrow afternoon he'll be getting an award and his car will be recognized. So in addition to that, we were lucky enough to have the opportunity to get Paul Anderson's car into the Standard of Excellence judging this morning, and he's in the running for that competition. That will be announced tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock. So Paul's car will also be on display here in front of the grandstand. And then I just found out about a half an hour ago, there's another award that is given to the best car from each country. And again, this is given by Carlisle Events, and they go around and they look at all the cars made in Italy, all the cars made in Germany, and every different country that's represented. And I want to tell you that we need to give Carl Herb a round of applause because he was chosen for the first car. He has a reason to stay here for the awards presentation tomorrow afternoon. So congratulations to all of you, and to Paul. I'm not sure where he got to. I know he's here somewhere, but good luck with that too. All right, so I'm going to start out talking a little bit about the history of CITROÊN. Every time I read about André CITROÊN and these crazy front-wheel drive cars, I learn something more. Whether you know it or not, he was not actually French. He was born to a Dutch Jewish father who was actually a diamond merchant. He went through school, and his first business venture, after being an engineer in the French Army, was in 1904 when he and 2 partners began making gear wheels. And they actually were a double helical gear design, which was very, very strong. And that's very important because that's where the double chevrons comes from. That was the design of the gear. If you've ever seen them, the gear teeth were actually V-shaped. So that is where the double chevrons for Citroën got their start. Although he was an engineer here, his expertise was actually in production. He didn't get involved with cars until 1908 when Moores, which was another French company, actually hired him to help set up their production. Then after the war broke out in 1914, he was called up to the French Army Reserve. And he very quickly realized that there was a terrible shortage of ammunition. So he sketched out a plan quickly, and he actually got approval from the French Armaments Ministry, and I guess some financial help. And he bought 30 acres of ground in Paris at the Bois de Chaval, and he built a huge factory, and by the end of the war they were making 55,000 shells a day. That was back in the late 1900s, so he must have known something about production. So at the end of the war, he had a huge factory on 30 acres. And of course, there wasn't much of a market for shells at that point anymore. So he decided to go into the car business, and he was very familiar with Henry Ford's mass production methods. By the 1930s, early 1930s, he was actually the largest car producer in France. And in 1931 was a very important year because two different things sort of put the seed in his mind about making a traction Avant. The one was he made a visit to Renault. Renault was his major competition, and they were undergoing a huge expansion, and he realized that they were going to take the lead in production if he didn't do something. Late in the year in 1931, he went to Budd Motor Company in Detroit, and he saw a prototype which they had made. He was already using some of their production methods to make the stamped steel bodies, and he was already putting on the CITROENS, but this prototype was actually a front-wheel drive car with a V8 engine in it. And one of the biggest things, it was a monocoque, so it was a single piece. The chassis was part of the body, unibody as we call it today. And he realized that, first of all, he could make it cheaper, and he could make an overall smaller sized car but have more interior room. So it made a lot of sense to him that maybe this was the way to go. Of course, front wheel drive was not totally new, but it was not terribly popular in the early 30s. So we'll jump ahead, and he took all this back to his existing engineering department and decided he wanted to produce a front-wheel drive car with a unibody chassis, and the colleagues in his company didn't agree with it. They told him it was going to be too expensive and it was going to take too long to produce a car like that, but Citroën was a pretty crazy guy, and most of them told him it would take until 1936 to put a car into production. So he went out and he found a new engineer. He found a new chief engineer and put a new bunch of people in place, and actually March 1st of 1933 was what most consider to be the beginning of the project that ended up being a traction. They were put in charge of the new front-wheel drive project, which was referred to internally as the PV, or Petite Voiture, or small car. Amazingly, and of course this was at Citroën's insistence because he wanted to get this car into production quickly to outdo Renault. So he started in March 1st, 1933 with a clean slate. By March 1934, they had a car ready and it was presented to the dealers, not as a car they could sell, but as something they could show to potential customers. On April the 18th of 1934, the car was showed to the press, and the following day, April 19th, 1934, is when they actually started to produce cars, when the first cars came off the production line. For any of us that know how long it usually takes to get a car into production, a year and 1 month is absolutely bizarre and absolutely crazy. Of course, when this car came out, it wasn't without issues. One of the biggest problems they had with pre-production cars was the gearbox. One of Citroën's ideas and insistences was that the car have an automatic gearbox. And they actually were producing cars with automatic gearboxes outsourced by a company called Citroën de Avant, maybe? I don't know, anyhow. In March of 34, they finally, the engineering team gave up and they said there was no way that that gearbox could be made to be dependable. And Citroën gave them 2 weeks to come up with a standard transmission to put in the car. So again, luckily the engineers had the foresight that they had already done some engineering on how to make a standard shift. But they were able.
Lots of big activities going on today. Don't forget, Autocross is still open for a little while yet. Make your way back there and check that out. Also, up on the D3 stage right now, we've got the Showdown band playing. They're over on top of Subway over there by D3. Stop over and check them out. Merle Powell's doing autographs down at Building Y.
All right, so in basically 2 weeks, they took the internal parts from a Citroën 8CV, which was actually like the top of the line rear-wheel drive car, and they put the gears into the automatic transmission gear case. And from what I can read,
great weather, beautiful cars, 2014 Import and Kit Nationals.
That 2-week deadline is sort of why the Traction Avant has such a bizarre gear change. They actually, back in the day, I've heard they called it the Eiffel Tower because of the way there's a gear tower at the gearbox and long rods, and it's also why the gear shift is on the dash and why it looks, they called it a mustard spoon back in the day. The Citroën wasn't the first car to be made with all of these engineering features, or it was. There were a lot of cars that were front-wheel drive, there were a lot of cars that had different features, but Citroën put them all together in one box, or one car. The first cars were only 1,303cc engines. They were called a 7CV, of course, which referred to the French horsepower. But Citroën again had put into the plans and into production that they would make 5 more body configurations and 2 more engines to be installed in the cars by 1934. So Citroën was pushing everything he could into this project. By the Paris Auto Show in October, when it was first officially shown, approximately 20,000 cars have been sold, and Citroën had a huge stand at the Paris show, and he actually had many of the planned bodies on display, including the 7CV, the 11CV, Légère, and Normal, and he also had cabriolets and fall cabriolets in production by then, and he also had a prototype of a V8 Traction Avant, which was on display at Paris but never really came to fruition. I'll explain why in just a moment. Of course, it became immediately obvious that the cost of introducing all these different variants of that car at once, as well as engineering a car in 1 year, the cost was astronomical. And although the range of tractions at that Paris show brought a lot of purchases, it was pretty obvious that Citroën was on the verge of bankruptcy. In fact, over the summer of 1934, Citroën had actually been already talking to the banks, trying to get money so that he could stay in business. In fact, the one thing that I read that I never knew before was that he even had traveled to Detroit and was negotiating with the American car companies to make the traction Avant here, I guess under another name badge. And that all fell through because Citroën was too demanding. He wanted a bunch of cash up front. The American car makers turned him down. So Citroën tried to shore up the country with his personal finances, which of course were also being heavily depleted by his gambling. So by December 21st of 1934, Citroën went into bankruptcy. And this is very important for those of us who know about Michelin tire being on all of our Citroëns. Michelin was the biggest creditor. They had actually put their people into Citroën's offices as early as the summer to keep an eye on the finances because they had such a stake in the production of this car and then the tires. By early 1935, Citroën basically had to vacate the company. And even though his car was going to become famous, he was basically an outcast, and he actually died in the summer of 1935. I think it was complications, maybe cancer, I'm not sure. But he basically died a broken man, both I'm sure mentally because of the losing his company, as well as financially. The total production of Citroën traction Avants, from what I can read, was 700,961 over a total of 23 years. The last car was produced on July 25th of 1957, and there were cars assembled in plants all over the world in France, Belgium, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, and Poland. And I often wondered why there were never any assembled here, but I guess maybe reading about the previous business dealings, that's the answer. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the changes in the cars. My 1950 is probably as close as we're going to see here today to one of those original cars. There were a lot of changes by 1950, but the basic body style is almost identical to what a 7CV would have been in the day. The front of the car would have had, instead of one here on the south, there were two. There was one side by side. The steel top, which one of these cars is made, is a round sort of a turret that is welded into. The chassis is made, there's two sides and a front and a rear, and they leave sort of an oval opening in the top. The original cars, that was soft, and I'm not sure in what year, but eventually in a couple of years they went to a welded steel top. The chevrons, instead of being in front of the grille, were behind the grille, where they weren't quite as obvious, and the horns were mounted out on the bumper instead of inside the engine compartment as they are in the later cars. On the side of the hoods, where mine has the louvers, they had a pair of doors that could be opened or closed to help cool the engine in the summer and to keep it warm in the winter. And what is really quite bizarre to me, I can show you, this car doesn't have much of a trunk or a luggage compartment in the back, but the original cars had two fuel fillers, one on either side of the spare tire, which I'm not sure why they decided to do that, but it did. But the most bizarre thing of all,
Building C and Building Y, we need that moved right away, please. Again, a maroon Ford Escort.
it did not have a trunk lid. There was no lid to the luggage compartment. But there was a luggage compartment, and to get to it, you had to physically take the back seat out of the car, and then you could put something back in there, but you couldn't get to it unless you took the seat out. So, although this car was so far ahead of its time in many things, it was a little bit behind too. Of course, the dashboard was different. There was a completely different speedometer, which is in the center of the dash, and there were two glove boxes. There was a glove box on either side of the dashboard. There were a lot of mechanical changes, including the real early cars had completely different motor mount system. They went to this system, which I believe is more of what they call the floating power, where it's got springs on the side of the engine. The early cars had friction shocks, and they had a tubular rear axle, and they had no rack and pinion steering. Rack and pinion steering didn't come until 1936. They had different wheels, of course, and they also had much smaller brakes, and of course much less performance. My car, which I've had for I guess about 31 years now, was originally registered in Rouen, which is northwest of Paris. It was purchased in 1968 by an American who was working over there. He was given a monthly stipend to rent a car while he was working there, which I believe was for about a year and a half or 2 years. And he decided, instead of renting a car, he would buy a used car. So in 1968, he bought this car from the original owner and drove it in Rouen to work. And when he came back to the States, he brought it back here. The car was in a fire in his barn in 1983 and was pretty much basically completely burned. The rear seat was burned out of it, the tires were burned off of it, all the body lid melted out of it. I was lucky enough